Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of April 14th, and this is your Monday briefing. Today, we're speaking with Pat Brown and Pam Olson on the future of global tax policy efforts, namely at the OECD. But first, some updates on the budget resolution and tariffs. Last week, the House approved the Senate-amended FY 2025 budget resolution, which clears the way for action on President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill and unlocks budget reconciliation procedures that would allow a bill to pass with a simple majority in the Senate. Once Congress returns from a scheduled 2-week spring recess, Republican leaders aim to pass final legislation perhaps as early as late May. President Trump paused his across-the-board reciprocal tariffs for 90 days, but the 10% baseline tariff and 25% tariff on automobiles, steel, and aluminum remain in effect with some exceptions. Meanwhile, the administration raised tariffs on China to 145%, and China retaliated with its own tariffs of 125%. How has this constant change impacted policy initiatives at global organizations? Here to discuss that very issue are Pat Brown and Pam Olson. Pat and Pam, welcome.
Good to be here, Scott.
Thanks for being with us. Pam, perhaps we could start with you. President Trump's executive orders came out on day one, and he put the OECD and foreign countries on notice, and since then has been following through on some of his promises, and we've seen some trade issues arise as a result. So could you talk a little bit about what you've heard and what you've seen in terms of the responses from other countries?
Yes, sure. It's been an interesting time. I think a lot of countries were hoping that those promises were actually threats and not promises, but they do indeed appear to be promises, at least so far. But really, I think foreign governments are trying to figure out, are the Trump tariffs something that are built to last, or are they a negotiating strategy? So, what we've heard leading up to or immediately after the 90-day pause last week was that somewhere between 50 and 75 governments have contacted the White House and asked for negotiations on the tariffs, and presumably those are underway. But I think governments are still trying to sort out, what does this mean? Where is it going? What we've seen have been moderate responses from the EU and the UK to the tariffs, but a more robust response from China. Indeed, it met the U.S. with tariffs, and it met the U.S. with restrictions on access to its market, as well as limits on sales of things from China that are essential in some industries. So China took a more strident response, and as a result of that, it would appear that when the pause was hit last week on the tariffs, China did not get the benefit of that pause. So the other countries that took a more measured approach seem to have come out of this okay, while China has gotten hit with the full force of the tariffs. Now, there was an apparent relaxation of the Chinese tariffs with respect to electronic products over the weekend, but that may or may not last because those products appear to be in line for some other tariffs that are going to be imposed on semiconductors and other products that are going to be put in a similar category as semiconductors. So that's kind of a wait and see. We may see stronger actions coming down the road in the future, depending on what happens with this 90-day reprieve. Does it turn into lasting negotiations that satisfactorily end the tariffs, or the high level of the tariffs that reach something that countries can live with, or does it go in a different direction? Certainly, if they come back, I think we're going to start to see some of those stronger actions, and some of those stronger actions might be tax related. We might see more in the way of DSTs. We might see countries imposing more of their own tariffs. And then there are a lot of other actions that they can take that limit access to their markets. The European Union has something called the anti-coercion instrument, which certainly some have been expecting that at some point soon it would bring to bear on this. So lots of other possibilities. I'm really interested in Pat's reflections on this.
Everything Pam said is fascinating to listen to, and just sort of understanding how all this unfolds. In our little corner of the world, Scott, we focus on tax, right? But Pam touched on this notion of where are the potential intersections, where are the potential overlaps between President Trump's broader trade initiatives and our world of tax. And I think one of the clearest areas, none of this is clear, right? This is all hard to figure out and unpack and dissect. But one of the clearest areas of potential overlap, Pam mentioned it explicitly, digital services taxes or DSTs, right? So we know, and I know we're going to get to the pillars, it seems unlikely that Pillar 1 is going to move forward. If Pillar 1's not going to move forward, countries have pledged to keep their DSTs. Perhaps some countries will introduce new DSTs, perhaps in response to some of President Trump's trade actions. At the same time, the United States has made it very clear it regards DSTs as a form of discriminatory taxation that's unacceptable. So one of the big questions hanging over all of this is, to what extent does the trade agenda and the tax agenda, to what extent do those two agendas overlap with each other? And one of the areas where it seems like that really could happen more easily is in this area of digital services taxes. So obviously we're all going to have to watch and learn together, but that's one of the areas I think to look at.
Sure. Pat, it's a great bridge from trade into tax, so maybe we could stick with that. There was a meeting last week in South Africa with regard to where the OECD is going on some of these issues.
Right.
So could you get us up to speed on where Pillar 1, where Pillar 2 are going, whether other countries have responded to the U.S. threat of tariffs or some further action if they do continue to proceed, and how is that unfolding?
Yeah. So the OECD, as you mentioned, there was a meeting last week in Cape Town of the Inclusive Framework. The OECD released a statement at the end of that meeting. Not surprisingly, it was an incredibly anodyne statement. Talked about how many delegates were there, talked in general terms about the topics that they discussed, a forward-looking agenda that talked about things like global mobility. There was one sentence that mentioned the pillars and talked about certainty and stability. But really nothing. And again, not surprising. They're trying not to get out in front of what obviously has to happen, which is some form of a negotiation or discussion between the United States and, frankly, the key other countries, the EU, the UK, the other members of the G7. So how is this all going to shape out? Well, we don't know, obviously. One of the things that we do know is that Congressional Republicans have focused their attention on the undertaxed profits rule of the UTPR, right? That's been the focus of discontent. And what we're sort of getting a sense from some of the other countries is there's an understanding that that's a flashpoint, that's a potential problem, but they've stated, some version of, well, the UTPR is essential to the operation of Pillar 2. And you sort of step back and think, well, what does that really mean? In the United States, we've adopted three minimum taxes over the last 8 years. None of them are the UTPR. So you can clearly adopt a minimum tax without the UTPR. I think what they're really saying, with these other countries who are saying the UTPR is essential, is essentially that in order to have every country do Pillar 2 in the same way and enforce it uniformly across everyone, you need to have some forcing mechanism like the UTPR. But that, Scott, of course, is exactly what Congressional Republicans find most objectionable, which is there's going to be some uniform standard that's set outside of the halls of Congress that everyone, including the United States, is expected to align to. So it is clear that the UTPR is the source of discontent for the United States. It is also clear that in the discussions, whatever accommodation is made to that, it's going to cause some friction. It's going to cause some discomfort for other countries because they look at the UTPR as really a very important element of the overall Pillar 2 framework. So how do we go forward from here? Obviously remains to be seen. We know what the United States is pushing for, which is an accommodation on the UTPR, and a meaningful one. And I don't think we come out the other side of this without some meaningful change with respect to the way the UTPR operates. But details are incredibly important. And at least at this point, we don't have them. So we're going to have to wait and see how this unfolds. So last week's meeting didn't really reveal much of anything, except the obvious point that no one wants to get out in front of the discussions that have to happen between the United States and other countries.
Sure, makes sense. So we had the meeting in South Africa. Are there other meetings coming up in the coming months, other milestones we might look towards where decisions might be taken?
So I think one of the things to look forward to is Ken Keyes getting confirmed as the Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy. So he had his confirmation hearing last week. That seemed to go well. If we, fast forward, assume he is confirmed not long after the Senate comes back into session, which you mentioned is in a couple of weeks, then I think Secretary Best and President Trump have in place their core team that will be responsible for coming up with a solution to the United States demands with respect to Pillar 2. So I think once Assistant Secretary Keyes, again, now just a nominee, once he is confirmed and in place and the team is in place, then we get a sense for, and how do they want to take this forward? I think from the OECD's perspective, what we are hearing is that there's an increasing focus at the OECD Inclusive Framework on the development of permanent safe harbors. Now, this is really interesting because for a couple of years now, companies rather have been really pushing on this point. We need permanent safe harbors that really significantly reduce the compliance burden associated with this. And up to now, they really haven't felt like they've been making much headway on that. But it does seem that among the sort of shifts in direction from the OECD, likely occasioned by a change in administration in the United States and the United States insisting on meaningful changes to the project, is kind of a revisitation of this question of, okay, how can we remove some of the other points of stress or points of friction in the project? So I think that's a hopeful sign for all companies who are having to deal with the compliance associated with Pillar 2, not just US companies, but really all companies having to deal with it, is that this is something the OECD appears to be starting to look at much more in earnest than they were, say, 6 months ago.
Sure. Pam, maybe I could turn to you to bring us home. What does this all mean for business, both the trade and the tax issues?
Well, there's not any good news in any of this, frankly. I mean, it's more of a wait and see, and that's just exactly what companies are going to have to do. But they're going to have to stay tuned in to everything that's going on the tariff front, and they're also going to have to stay tuned to everything that's going on the legislative front and at the negotiations with the OECD in the international framework. So lots of wait and see, lots of continuing to kind of sit on pins and needles, but very important for companies to stay engaged in it.
Pam, thank you so much. Pat, thank you for being with us. Appreciate you both very much. Your insights are always welcome. Thank you.
Absolutely.
And for our viewers, you'll find links in the description of this episode to Week in Review with Rohit Kumar, as well as a new IRS update with Nicole Flax. We appreciate you spending this time with us. Thank you very much, and take care.